Committee on Finance. And somewhere I will find my agenda. And before we start, yeah, I've got it. Will that go away? I have to tell them I've got it where it's being live streamed. Just wanted to let you know, I did talk to Craig Johnson from the Interstate Sales Tax Commission in response to the letter we sent regarding feminine hygiene products. And he will send us a letter to confirm. He was on the road, so I had to wait till he got back to the office. But basically, they considered using that terminology instead of hygiene and sanitary. And they stayed with the original one because several states had already enacted it using the hygiene and sanitary language. He says we have no problem if we want to use the terminology menstrual product. So we can put what we want in our law as long as we tax or don't tax the same thing. We're good to go. And he will follow that up with a letter.
Okay.
I am starting in my head to put together agendas for the session. It looks like we're going to be doing broadband again. This time maybe more how we make sure we get it out and get folks hooked up, and we're going to have to probably deal with affordability. I don't know what's coming our way. I've got a briefing on the pensions discussion today at noon. I don't know if there's going to be tax or revenue raising proposals in either that or the waiting study. If there probably will be in one of the other, and so we'll have to do some time there. And then take a look at the bills in committee. We know we've got this one, cloud, and the corporate tax rewrite. But take a look at those and see if there's any you want to do or anything else you want to take a look at, and we'll get it on the agenda and get working on it. Just drop me a note and do that. I also have been scheduling meetings with interested parties, otherwise known as lobbyists. This is the season, but I have been using the finance room. Senator McDonald has a meeting scheduled there. It's open if anyone wants to come down and use it. It'll probably be just the two of us in Washington County. Just let me know so by odd chance we don't double book it. As far as I know, I have one yet to be timed meeting on Friday and one tomorrow there. But that, as far as I know, I don't have any after that. So we're going to start this morning, and I've got to find my agenda. I'll find it. But Abby, are you up? We're going to get a walkthrough as to this today. We're looking at the cloud tax. You and Graham, I understand, have a program set up or something. So the floor is yours, and I'll let you go to work on that. And I will go to work on finding my agenda. Here it is.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. Graham and I will be presenting the presentation that's under Graham's name on the committee webpage today under today's date. So we will be reviewing the pre-written computer software that's in current law, what is proposed in the House amendment to S53, which, as you were just discussing, the feminine hygiene products sales tax exemption, that was originally the vehicle that the Senate passed that exemption out in. The House sent it back with this language on it, as well as the corporate income tax changes.
I guess they're relevant.
So I also provided 2 documents. One is the full language of the House amendment. There is also a summary that I did of the relevant sections that have to do with the cloud tax. So I have most of that explanation in this PowerPoint, which is what Graham and I will be basing our presentation off of. And at some point, if you want me to, I can flip to the language to show you that.
Okay, this is under, we've got the House proposal, the summary. Is that what we should be looking at? Or Graham has sales in use on pre-written?
Let's start with what's under Graham's name, because that'll give you all the background. And then if we need to, we can flip between the other documents. But I just wanted to give you all of the context. And I will be starting that off, and then Graham will take over on the revenue side of things.
Okay.
Would you like me to share my screen? Share the document,
that might be helpful.
Okay. In that case, I won't be able to see you. So if anyone has any questions, please shout out, and I will.
And I will say the same thing. I can't see you either, so.
Great. So this is the presentation that we're going to be using today. So to start, the title is Pre-written Computer Software because that's what is in current law. In S53, there's a different term that's being created, and we'll discuss that as we go through this. So the very first starting point is statutes, the Vermont statutes annotated. Vermont sales tax does apply. The general rule is it applies to the retail sale of tangible personal property unless an exemption applies. And the definition of tangible personal property includes pre-written software. And this definition is based off of the streamlined agreement. And many states use a very similar definition of TPP. So it's personal property which may be seen, weighed, measured, felt, touched, or in any other manner perceived by the senses. TPP includes electricity, water, gas, steam, and pre-written computer software. Unlike tangible personal property, charges for a service, this is sort of an aside to set this general discussion up, charges for a service are generally not taxable in Vermont unless there's a specific list that says that charge for a service is taxable. And the definition of pre-written computer software is not in statute. It is in a Vermont Department of Taxes rule. So it does have the force of law. And it is also based off of the streamlined agreement definition. So I've only included the first sentence because of the length of this definition. It goes into a lot of detail about customization. So the general rule is that pre-written computer software means computer software, including upgrades, pre-written upgrades, which is not designed and developed by the author or other creator to the specifications of a specific purchaser. So that first sentence is crucial to distinguish between what's called canned or commercial off-the-shelf software, which is what pre-written computer software is, versus customized software. So what we're talking about is this canned software. Again, the definition is from the streamlined agreement, and the agreement which Vermont joined, Vermont is a full member, in 2007. The agreement allows states to exempt canned software when it's delivered electronically or by load and leave. Exempt or tax, both, sorry. So the current state of law comes from Vermont session law, which in 2015 created an exemption from sales tax for pre-written sales and use tax for pre-written computer software, but only when it's accessed remotely. Another way of referring to remote access to pre-written computer software is software as a service, or SaaS, which most of this presentation uses just for making it a little bit simpler and a little bit shorter. So to summarize, under current law in Vermont, pre-written computer software, when it's purchased, on storage media, so in a box, it is taxable. If it's downloaded to a computer in Vermont, it is also taxable. When it's accessed remotely via the internet, so there's no downloading, it is not taxable. And the way that Vermont got to this point is in the next few slides. I've provided some of the legislative context. This has been under discussion for over a decade. In 2010, the Department of Taxes issued a technical bulletin interpreting the law as imposing sales tax on pre-written computer software, irrespective of how it's accessed. The legislature responded in 2012 by imposing a moratorium on sales tax for any pre-written computer software accessed remotely until July 1st, 2013, and it allowed for refunds of tax to customers between January 1st, 2007 and July 1st, 2013. In 2013 to 2014, the department issued guidance outlining the taxation and the exemption of SaaS, and then circulated those draft regulations for comment. Those regulations or rules were never enacted. They never became law. The legislature in 2015, which is the language that you just saw, created a session law exemption for pre-written computer software accessed remotely, or SaaS. In 2019, so there still has been some back and forth about whether or not it should stay exempt or be taxed. And in 2019, the legislature required the department to do outreach and education for the tech sector on their responsibilities in terms of collecting or not collecting tax, both under current law and what would happen if there was a repeal of the exemption. Last year, S53, as I mentioned, was passed out of the Senate uniquely as the feminine hygiene products exemption. It was amended in the House, or the House proposed an amendment. As we saw a few weeks ago, it's quite a lengthy amendment. It does include the corporate income tax sections. Today, we're just talking about the cloud sections, which are in sections 9 through 12 of the bill. The first three sections, 9 through 11, impose sales and use tax on vendor-hosted pre-written computer software. It provides a new definition for that, and associated services that are accessed remotely, data processing services more specifically. And then the 2015 session law exemption is repealed. And under that bill, all of those changes to the taxation of cloud were made effective on June 1st. At the time, that would have given, 2022. So at the time, that would have given a year of lead time. So that might be, if this were to move forward, changing that date might be something to take into account. And more specifically, I've provided a definition here of what is a vendor-hosted pre-written computer software. This is a summary of what's in the language. If you'd like, I could also pull that up, but I think this is a good way to work off of that language. So in the new language that's proposed by the House, vendor-hosted pre-written computer software is defined as software, again, this is canned software, that's accessed through the internet or a vendor-hosted server or platform, including where possession of that software is maintained by either the vendor or a third party. And the definition applies regardless of the way that the software is delivered or transferred, including downloading, which under current law is already taxable, whether the access is permanent or temporary, and how the charge for the right of accessing that software is set up. So it could be per use, per user, per license, subscription, it doesn't matter how the charge is applied. What's a little different, there are two things that are a little different in this language. One, this vendor-hosted pre-written computer software definition is intentionally very broad. Broader than other language that this committee has seen in past sessions and bienniums. It also creates a new taxable category. So it's in addition to tangible personal property, this is creating a vendor-hosted pre-written computer software category of taxation, both in the sales tax and the use tax sections. So maybe I'll pause there to see if there are any questions, or if you want me to show you the language. I'm going to also speak about what other states are doing.
Yeah, Abby, I've been told that this taxes not just the software, but that it taxes the platform, software as a service. There's some difference. between the software and the service, and this taxes both, other states don't. Can you help those of us that are not techies to understand that?
So we could either, I'm not sure if we should jump ahead. We do address that
Okay,
further on.
okay, that's fine,
Um,
as we're gonna
And
understand that difference, because that difference seems,
it's important, absolutely. This is a broader, this would be catching more forms of software as a service. There are several different types. Those categories are not defined in law. Other states do not define them. And even within the industry, there is some fluidity between those categories. But before we move.
Abby, could I jump in,
Yes.
Madam Chair? Abby, don't just tell me if you address this down the road, but this, I've always struggled with this because it seems really hard to be precise, and I think taxation, I'm all for, I'm not afraid of taxes, but I think they need to be clear and straightforward. And so it seems like there's a really bright line here between software that anyone can buy, and it gets really, the whole issue gets confusing when you're talking about services that also depend on software. So, the real estate broker that uploads pictures of my house when I'm selling it because they subscribe to some platform. I'm wondering if, and maybe you talk about this later, we'll just pause my question, but does the House have, or does anyone testified about how we would be able to verify that the pre-written computer software has not or has been modified? I mean, why wouldn't I, if I'm a business, just figure out how to make a tiny tweak to a piece of software, and then I just say, well, it's not pre-written, we changed it, and therefore I don't have to pay the tax. Does that question make sense?
It does, and that's actually, the tiny tweaks are addressed already in the definition of pre-written computer software that I didn't provide fully. If it's a very small tweak, so I can, combining two or more pre-written computer software programs doesn't cause a combination to become something else. When it is developed by the author or creator, the specifications to a specific purchaser, it's still considered pre-written software. It's where there's a significant customization that it becomes something other than that definition.
And has anyone testified about whose job it is to certify that it's significant or not?
That I don't know that there has been any, whether that has been addressed. That is part of the intent. Again, I don't want to be in the position of testifying on behalf of Ways and Means, but some of the testimony that informed their decision was that creating a broader definition of this remote access, part of the intention was to capture everything as opposed to trying to slice and dice and have just the service, the SaaS. And my understanding in the past, the reason why there was this blanket exemption was also to avoid having to determine exactly what falls in and what falls out.
All right, thank you.
Madam Chair, should I move on to the other
I think
states
so,
and then
yeah.
we'll go into more detail? Okay. So this does relate to this discussion. The way that most states tax software as a service is by using a very similar definition of tangible personal property, like in Vermont. So there are 23 full member states of the streamlined agreement. So they all use that same definition of TPP. Then where it becomes a little messier and where it's hard to draw the line between how a state is taxing the different types that we were just discussing is because each state then has its own case law and administrative rulings and does it on a somewhat piecemeal basis. So looking just at SaaS, software as a service, there are certain states that have a broader application of their sales tax, and others that have a much more restricted application. The language that's in S53 as proposed by the House is based on states that use broader language to capture more types of access, so more services. These are Iowa, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Washington. Rhode Island and Washington are both streamlined states. On the other side, there is also broad language, but it's because it's not, the application is broad. The language is actually quite simple in states such as Hawaii and New Mexico because they tax it as a service. So those are not really an example for Vermont because Vermont doesn't really tax services. There are very few that it taxes, whereas those states capture SaaS because they treat it as a service. So there is a map that's very useful to see the breakdown. There are different ways of sort of slicing and dicing. This particular map from TaxJar provides some distinction as to whether SaaS is being taxed on personal versus business use. There are a lot of other ways to slice this. I also wanted to point out, and I did put a note on this, that Alaska is listed as taxing it. The state of Alaska doesn't actually tax it, but local jurisdictions do have sales tax. I would have put Alaska in gray just because the state doesn't impose a sales tax. The next slide has a list that I've compiled. So it's just another way of showing this information split into the states that tax software as a service, those that exempt. So it's very close. Washington, DC, and New York City do both tax software as a service. And then there are the 5 states that do not have a sales tax, and I included Alaska there.
And Abby, I think when we started a decade ago, there were very few states that were taxing software as a service. That the number of states doing that has picked up over time, if my memory is serving me correctly.
Yes.
But we would have been in a small minority if we'd done this 10 years ago.
So there have been a handful of states that have moved towards taxing. Indiana is one notable exception. I'm on the next slide, I've provided a few recent changes. Indiana actually moved towards exempting, but all of these other states have moved toward either broadening their taxation. So for example, Alabama, the effective date is a little later and doesn't end up it's not in chronological order, but there was the case was in 2018 or end of 2019. Alabama, the Supreme Court interpreted their statute more broadly than the department had in the past and held that all software is tangible personal property and is subject to sales tax. However, they generally would not include SaaS as a taxable product or service unless it's bundled with software that would otherwise be taxable. So there's a lot of caveats in how each state taxes SaaS. So Indiana moved towards exempting remote access of pre-written computer software. Rhode Island and Iowa both use the term vendor-hosted pre-written computer software, which is what S53 uses as its new definition. They've both moved towards taxing it irrespective of the form of delivery, whether it's a physical or downloaded access. Maryland also has had a fair amount of movement. Massachusetts has had some case law, but it hasn't changed how they're taxing. There hasn't been legislative movement. Maryland, however, did have I think it was a 2020 bill that became effective this March, where canned or custom software has become a taxable product. However, there are some exemptions. And then Connecticut also had 2 different rates, and effective in 2019, increased its electronically transferred software to the much higher rate, general rate of 6.35% instead of the 1% reduced rate.
Questions at this point? Okay.
Great. So as we have been discussing, there are these different types, and Graham, I'm not sure if you want to jump in here, if you want me to cover this slide. It gets into your portion as well. I'm sorry, I can't see anyone. I can continue to share if that works for you.
It's up to you, or I can take over. I can share my screen and put it up on my screen and flick through. Why don't we just do that? Let me see. So are we on the right slide here? Prewritten software terms? Thumbs
What
up?
we were on, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So for the record, Graham Campbell from the Joint Fiscal Office. My role here in my presentation is obviously to go through the revenue estimates, but I guess to help the committee, I think, better understand what exactly we're talking about here when we're with respect to S53, and to highlight some of the differences that are in S53 versus what this committee has seen in the past regarding the taxation of cloud-based computer software. And so I just want to, first say that, I understand sort of Abby and my limitations on, understanding exactly this industry. And we've sort of giving a sort of an overview, a simple sort of presentation for the committee. And, but there may be sort of details and nuance in here that we're sort of missing. But I think that's sort of the case with lots of sales tax items. Sales tax can be pretty complicated. So apologies in advance for missing sort of some details that you might pick up, later from future testimony. So, S53 expands the taxable base to pre-written software accessed remotely. And within this sort of world, you see terms like software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service, all of which are currently exempt in Vermont. And I want to emphasize that these terms, these three terms, are not necessarily defined in law or in S53, or frankly in the this industry. So it's not as if S53 says software as a service shall become taxable, platform as a service shall become taxable. What it more or less does, as Abby said, is it defines pre-written software as a very broad type of software and service. And so S53 sort of ropes in all of these. And so, but to help the committee better understand what we're talking about here, it's helpful to put, this type of software into these three buckets. So SaaS is more or less defined as when a server provides the hosting software applications over the internet for a consumer. So this is sort of the classic TurboTax example where you used to buy it in a box, but nowadays you access it over the internet. All the sort of framework for doing your taxes or for using the software is built by the developer. And it's sort of as Abby sort of touched on, a canned or off-the-shelf type of software. There's not much customization that the user does here. Platform as a service contains elements of infrastructure, which I'll talk about, and software as a service. But software or platform as a service provides more of a framework for developers to build and create customized applications. So you're sort of trending from SaaS, where almost everything is developed for the user, to platform, where some parts, some elements of the software may be pre-developed by the developer, but the user itself may have some sort of autonomy to create within that platform. And then infrastructure as a service is when the service provider owns, maintains, operates, and houses equipment such as hardware, servers, network components used to support the customer's operations. The customer accesses the equipment over the internet, has complete control of the infrastructure. So the classic example of this is like Amazon Web Services, where the user itself is designing essentially an app, the software, but they are using Amazon Web Services to say host the app. And so I think I have a slide 2 down, but the sort of big distinguisher between these three, I would say, is the amount of what we would call how much of it is canned, how much of it is already designed by the developer. If to answer the question, if the answer to that question is, it's basically the user interacting with already pre-written, completely finished software. Then it's SaaS. If it's the user has to design, the app themselves, and but they just need someone to host it over the internet, that's infrastructure as a service. So to give examples of what this is, so SaaS is probably I think the most easily defined, and I think most easy to grasp. TurboTax and QuickBooks, the classic examples here, you used to be able to buy it in a box. Now you access it over the internet. Almost everything in that program is designed for you as a user. You just interact with the software. The same goes for Microsoft Office Online or Adobe Photoshop. The whole program itself is designed. All you do is pay a subscription or a fee to access those over the internet. Dropbox, MailChimp, all the Google apps. So if you pay for extra storage or for extra features on those, that's the example of SaaS. And Toast and Square. So Toast being the online restaurant management software that restaurants use, and Square being the payment system. Those are already pre-designed, more or less. All the customer does is pay to use it over the internet. So that's sort of SaaS. Platform is, you're getting more into customization by the user. So I think the good example of this is Squarespace. So it has elements of SaaS in it, but within Squarespace, you're more or less, you're given the opportunity as a user to customize, what website you want to build, but the software for doing so is already there for you to do it. Salesforce and Force also an example of that. So they provide sort of a background sort of platform on which you can customize the product or the software that you want to create. And then infrastructure as a service, you don't get any of that. It's more or less just a hosting type of software where you create and then you ask them to host. And so this chart sort of, I think, helps lay it out a little bit clearer. So on the far left, you see on-premises. That is, what we would, at least in this tax world and what we're talking about here, define as, customizable software on-premises. Let's say I wanted a developer to design me a piece of software that does JFO fiscal estimates. I would go to a company, they would design that on, in-house, a custom, software solution for me. That's sort of the far left, and that does not become taxable under this. What starts to become taxable is the three on the right here. So infrastructure as a service. So you can see the sort of green boxes here. So the apps, the data, the runtime, the operating system, that's all run by the user. That's all created, it's all customized. But the virtualization, the servers, the storage, and the networking is managed by a company like Amazon for Amazon Web Services. And as we move, to the right, more and more of the pieces of the sort of making the software work and operable is managed by other people, such that when you're in software as a service, basically everything is taken care of by the company. It's designed, it's hosted, and it's, all the storage of the data is done by the company, and all the user needs to do is just interact with the software. So that's sort of a way of delineating what we're talking about here. So everything on the far left, if you are getting customizable software, built, and you're paying a firm to do that, that does not become taxable under this bill. If you say design an app, but pay Amazon Web Services to host your app, then your subscription or what you pay to Amazon Web Services will become taxed. If you design a website over Squarespace, the subscription that you pay to Squarespace will become taxable. And then for software as a service, if you use QuickBooks Online, the subscription to that will become taxable. So is that, I guess, a little bit clearer for the committee? So prior to...
Can I just jump in, Madam Chair? Sorry.
Yeah.
Graham, one of the things I'm trying to understand here is would and maybe for Abby as well, isn't there some, I don't know if it's concern, but But like if I own a landscaping business, I pay sales and use on my tractor once. It's part of my business costs. That's part of my back end costs, and then I go out and get customers. Those customers never, maybe my payment model handles that, but that's all internal. They're never seeing a tax because on my service or the equipment that I bought. But if I'm subscribing to something and the vendor has this back end software as a service, aren't we sort of paying that tax over and over and over again?
I think that's an excellent question. That's one of the things I highlight on my sort of pros and cons of this. And there is the concern about the taxation of intermediate inputs. So a software developer is almost certainly using, one of these types of softwares to design their own software. And so typically in sales tax, you try to avoid that, what we call tax pyramiding, where the business pays the tax on the input and then they charge the consumer sales tax on what they sell to the consumer. So yes, that is absolutely a concern. And so that's typically something that we try to, in sales tax policy, try to avoid, because we make it on the final sale. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen in practice. If a contractor goes to Home Depot and buys supplies for their business, they'll pay the sales tax on that. And if they end up selling anything to a consumer, then they are legally supposed to collect and remit sales tax. So I think it's an excellent point. Practically speaking, I don't think any sales tax system in any state is able to completely avoid intermediate inputs. I don't know if Abby has anything to add on that.
So I have a few thoughts. Depending on, a rental or a lease is charged sales tax for one. I know it's maybe a slightly different structure here. There's also the sale for resale is excluded from the definition of retail price. So if it were clear enough that it was not the end user that was purchasing the software and it was then being resold, it would not be subject to tax. But Graham's point about inputs is an important one. And some states have explicitly created exemptions to say if you are incorporating this into another product that is the final sale, it will be exempt. So that is one consideration if the committee wanted to make any changes along those lines to get into creating exemptions. That is one option.
And I would just add a little bit more color to this, that within our existing sales tax code, we have, as Abby said, we have exemptions for inputs. So we have the agricultural inputs exemption, we have the inputs to manufacturing exemption. Those exemptions, both in statute and in regulation, have specific rules about what type of input we're talking about and how we define something as input. So it has to be sort of, at least in the manufacturing, that it has to be directly used in the manufacturing of the good. And so, if the legislature decided to go down that path, then I think it would be the responsibility for statute and potentially and for rules to sort of make that delineation of, for a software company, if they're using Dropbox for something that is partially business related and partially not, then how do we delineate whether that's a business input or not?
Madam Chair, I have a question.
Yes. Yep. Senator Stockton.
Thank you, Abby and Graham. This is helpful. Just picking up on Senator Pearson's question, I think I understand the answer in terms of pyramiding. Where I'm getting confused is, are we just talking about, well, let me back up. I mean, the most simplest version is buying TurboTax off the shelf versus buying it through the computer, but through the internet. But are there situations where once you buy the product that there are annual or usage charges, and are they different from the initial purchase? I don't know if I'm being clear, but it seems like we're moving in the direction of taxing services here
Yes.
in some ways. And I'm just wondering, are we talking about that here? Are we just talking about buying an internet product or program, or are we talking about buying ongoing services off that platform?
So it's an excellent question. So I would say that a lot of, at least within software as a service, a lot of the models, the payment is not an upfront payment. It's a monthly or annual subscription. Microsoft Office being an example, that's an annual subscription fee, and that you're accessing over the Adobe Photoshop, another one. You can buy that in a box, or maybe you can't. You used to be able to buy that in a box, but nowadays you pay a subscription. So you'd be paying sales tax on the subscription to the software. As for the service, I think I'll turn that over to the sort of delineation between what is being taxed here and ongoing service charges. I'll let Abby take that.
So that is contemplated in the language. It does say it's irrespective of the way the charge is structured. So whether it's a subscription, annual, per use basis, any type of charge is taxable. That said, there are provisions within current sales and use tax rules that deal with maintenance contracts, as well as bundling transactions. So when there are non-taxable services, if they're itemized, those non-taxable services would remain non-taxable. But if they were bundled, so it was all just one fee, if it wasn't split out on an invoice, then it would all be taxable.
So perhaps an example would help here. Suppose a software designer, they were offering some sort of pre-written computer software, sort of canned software they sell to lots of people. And they sell it to a business and let's say, it's going to cost you $1,000 a month, and that's going to include access to the software, but also any tech support that you need. If they bundle that transaction as $1,000, both the tech support and the access to the software, then that would be subject to the entire sales and use tax. However, if the firm itemized the pieces and said, okay, of the 1,000, 800 is going to be for access to the software and 200 is going to be for maintenance, and tech support, then the 200 would not be taxable. So
That's the way it's structured under S53 as the House passed it.
Yes, that's how it works, and that's also how it works in current sales tax law. So if a firm bundles any transaction together with non-taxable and taxable items, and then the entirety pays the sales tax. But if they itemize it, then only the taxable items get paid. Another example that I'm working with, new recruits in JFO is florists, for instance. Florists sell things like vases and ribbon and stuff like that, but they also sell their services to, weddings. And so if a florist were to itemize the cost of the vases and the ribbon from the overall service charge, then only the vases and the ribbons would pay the sales tax as opposed to the entire thing. But if they bundle them, that whole package together, then it pays the 6% sales tax under sales tax law currently.
Thank you.
Questions, or we can keep going. Not be our last presentation on this. I think this is the first time. And then if we go forward, we will continue to increase our understanding. The House has been sent this one to us several times. They have been working on it for years. So that's why we're doing this off session, just to give ourselves some time to catch up.
Yeah. So what happens in S53? So all three types of that type of vendor hosted computer software become taxable. And again, it's not as if SAS, PASS, and IASS are written into S53. It's just essentially a very broad definition of pre-written computer software. But as of May 2021, this bill was expected. So because it was made effective June 1st, 2022 in the bill, there was no impact on fiscal 22 revenues, but there was an increase in sales tax revenues of $10.9 million, growing to 12.3 and $13.9 million in fiscal year 25. And I've showed the various pieces here as only a sort of illustration of previously the SAS line was more or less what was the revenue estimate before, because the sort of earlier iterations of this, the committee has seen, and that the House passed, was more narrowly defined to SAS. And so this iteration expands and makes that broader definition, which ropes in these two other types of software. And so they add, approximately, they double essentially the revenue estimate.
Can I ask a question?
Yes. Senator McDonald?
This is Senator Brock.
Senator Brock, sorry.
Just a question. As part of the intent of this, a recognition that software that is sold in a box is declining in use and is being replaced by software as a service, and is part of this design to catch the revenue that's being lost? And do we have any calculation that would support that argument, if that's the argument being made?
That we're seeing a declining revenue source of traditional sales of software?
Yep.
I don't have a revenue estimate for what we have potentially lost in sales tax from traditional, off the shelf box purchases of software. So no, I don't have that number. But yes, I think what you're saying is correct, that the idea here is to more or less have the sales tax base more accurately reflect the way that people are purchasing software at the moment.
Yeah, I'm really just trying to get an understanding. Is this a move to tax something because we can, as opposed to a move to replace revenue that we may be losing elsewhere, which is perhaps a little bit more a little bit easier to justify, at least at this point in time?
I don't want to speak for the Ways and Means Committee. What I would say is that the sort of one-to-one comparison about buying software off the shelf at Staples, that is, that's captured kind of here by the SaaS portion. But things like platform as a service and infrastructure as a service, didn't really exist a whole lot even 10 years ago. And so I think it's probably, I think the Ways and Means Committee can speak to it more, but there's sort of two layers here. It's, potentially modernizing the sales tax base to capture those previous types of sales that were happening, but also, this newer type of software that wasn't necessarily around back then. And then one more final note on these revenue estimates. So for the session, I will update these with new data. But historically, every time I've done these estimates, they've increased. And that's just because of the huge uptake in software being accessed remotely over the past 10 years. And it wouldn't surprise me that, the COVID-19 pandemic has really hit the accelerator on that type of take up. So it would be my guess at this point in time that these numbers will go up next time you see them. So I tried to summarize essentially what like kind of pros and cons here for the committee a little bit. And I'll fully concede that there might be some that I'm forgetting here. And I think perhaps the other witnesses might be able to assist more in that regard. But so the sort of why you might apply the sales tax to this type of software. The first is that the tax, as Senator Brock kind of touched on, the tax currently applies to you buy this software from a box, from a store in a box. And so you have this incongruence between, essentially the exact same software, but different purchasing methods. And so that may be and it's certainly less of an issue than it used to be, because not very many people are buying software out of the box, but people still do buy software out of the box. And it pays the sales tax, but if you use the sort of online platform, you don't. Exact same software. So there's the policy, sort of the number one policy reason I think that was put forward originally for this. The next is that the state currently taxes other types of digital products that are similar to this, that are sort of servicey in nature, but they are sort of considered TPP. So audiobooks, Netflix subscriptions, Zoom subscriptions are all currently taxable under Vermont sales tax. The third is ideally your sales tax base, and this is just sort of broader, and I think Bram Kleppner of the Tax Structure Commission might touch on this a little bit, but your sales tax base as a policy should be broad and should reflect the current economy. So, the modern economy uses significant vendor-hosted computer software over the internet, and especially since COVID-19, that's become more and more important. This is somewhat, somewhat akin to expanding your sales tax base to remote purchases. Back pre-2018, the modern economy, e-commerce was a huge part of our economy, and so states, have moved into trying to capture those types of sales. The post-Wayfair, so the Wayfair decision being that states can collect sales tax from remote sales. Post-Wayfair, states have moved more into the direction of taxing this good, as Abby has talked about. We've seen sort of more states making this taxable than exemptions being put in place or a repeal of taxation. And then finally, the compliance costs are not necessarily what they used to be, especially post-Wayfair, because more and more states are taxing this software. So if you're a software company, making sort of off-the-shelf software, and you're based in Vermont, and you sell to a state that does tax this, then you technically should be collecting and remitting sales tax to those states. And there are companies that exist that help with sales tax compliance on these issues, like Avalara and Taxjar. And they're sort of, because this is a more mature industry at this point in time, sort of these companies are sort of more knowledgeable about how to comply with state tax laws. But why might you not apply the sales tax to the software, to this type of software? And that the first is that, as I think the committee has sort of said in the past and today, that the definitions of what this is exactly are not necessarily set in stone. It's a sort of a gray area. So for SaaS infrastructure and platform as a service, many products are sort of a mix of two or all three. So how can how can a business know whether it's producing something that is taxable or not? That's a totally fair question. The tax department, creates rules and regulations around what is taxable and what is not. But that doesn't ignore the fact that complexity is sort of inherent to the sales tax. I thinking about this, I thought about the manufacturing exemption, right? This committee and this legislature has gone back and forth about, is this piece of machinery directly used in manufacturing of a good? So is it subject to the manufacturing exemption? That type of complexity is always going to exist in the sales tax, but it doesn't ignore the fact that it can be burdensome for businesses. What about, and this is a question that I think Senator Sorokin brought up, but what about like contracts where maintenance or some sort of service where service is not considered tangible personal property, is bundled with the software sale? That is, I think, an issue in this industry, which makes it more complex for businesses. As we've touched upon, if you itemize the good, the tax department and rules and regulations say that only the taxable items become taxable, and the service part of the contract would not be taxable. Or you can choose to bundle them and pay the 6% on the entirety of the transaction. The compliance costs for particularly smaller businesses, that sell this type of software could be burdensome. So even though the companies like Avalara and Taxjar exist for compliance, they still have to pay those firms to comply with with state sales taxes. And then finally, I touched upon this with Senator Pearson, is that's the taxation of intermediate goods. So software firms use a lot of this type of software in the creation of their final product. And generally, sales tax systems try to avoid taxation of intermediate goods. That's why we have, exemptions for inputs in certain areas, in certain industries. But as I said back when I answered Senator Pearson's question, in practice, sales taxes are inadvertently, taxing intermediate purchases all the time. And so, discussion about whether this is whether to exempt or exclude intermediate purchases is something that was brought up last session. And so it's something to consider here. And that's all I have. So I can take any
Okay,
questions.
committee. Go back here to, lost it again. Okay, committee questions at this point.
I have a question, Madam Chair.
Yeah, Senator Sirotkin.
Probably jumping the gun a little bit, but in terms of pros and cons from the economy and the business community, what are the arguments just generally? I think we'll hear them later as to potentially attracting or losing software developers in the state as a result of imposing a cloud tax.
We've got people coming on this afternoon that can probably answer that better. I think what I've seen in the last decade is we went on, when we first started, we were basically talking about TurboTax. And it was pretty easy to understand. You buy it in a box, you pay. You go buy a computer, and rather than a box with a disk, they give you a card with a website and you download it. It stays on your computer. But if you pay a service fee and go to the internet, do your taxes, submit them, TurboTax isn't on your computer and you don't pay a tax on that. Since then, in the last decade, it's gotten a lot more complicated. And the other thing that's changed is I think there were like 5 states, maybe less when we started. And now the last number I heard was the 21 states tax. And it looks like, depending on how you define it, more and more states are going there. And the other question, and we do have Bram coming on, part of the NCSL thing, and I sent you all of you the link to the information, was on updating your tax code for the future. And when we started, we taxed property because if you own property, that indicated your wealth. Then we went to sales because if you bought things, it indicated your wealth. But our economy is moving more to service. And this is kind of making that step into service. And because that's where the economy is going. And how do you define service? If I go and buy a topographical map at the stationery store, I pay a tax on it. But if I pay a surveyor to produce a topographical map, I don't believe, unless it's
But you
if
pay a
it's
lot.
bundled service. I've never paid it. But if he lays it out separately, it is. But this area in particular has moved from buying something in a box to buying it online to using it online and paying for that use. So, and I think that's, and this committee just hasn't had the time because we deal with other things other than taxes to delve into this, but it's changed since we first started it rapidly. So this did not take anywhere near the amount of time we thought it would. So are there other questions? So Graham, you went over the revenue estimates. Maybe we could focus on those for a minute and take a look at the projections. We haven't had a projection on the budget or revenue forecasts. But from everything I understand, our base revenues are not are just increasing enough to cover our mandatory costs without any new programs being added. We've been like this for years. So this would be new revenue. We may also be looking for new revenue for some increased costs. So this might become a source. So Graham, walk us through in a little more detail
Sure.
on what we're looking at.
Yeah. So obviously, so the way this functions is it's an expansion of the sales tax base, and so nothing about the rate is changing here. And so essentially, we're making the amount of things that would be taxable bigger in the state, and so it increases revenue, obviously. The sales tax is 100% dedicated to the education fund, and so this
Right now.
Right now, yes. It is dedicated to the education fund. S53 does not make any diversions of the sales tax to the general fund or any other fund. And so this money, as it's written in S53, would essentially drop into the education fund, and then depending upon education spending, property taxes, and then other uses on the ed fund, all else being constant, this would lower property taxes by a little bit over a penny on average, but obviously lots of things happen, outside sales tax revenues. House prices go up and down, and education spending goes up and down, property tax credits, et cetera. And so, so this essentially drops right into the education fund and would, ongoing. The sales tax in the forecast was significantly higher than what it was pre-pandemic. I think the sales tax forecast for fiscal year 22 in July of for the July 2021 forecast is I think over $70 million higher than what it was in the January 2020 forecast. So the sales tax revenues are kind of experiencing, like many other taxes in the state, sort of a level shift upwards in revenue. And the sales tax, I think, is slightly more at risk to sort of not decline, but sort of to come back down towards normality. And that's because the sort of unprecedented amount of federal fiscal stimulus that was dumped into the economy has led to a lot of people, having a lot more disposable income than we had pre-pandemic, and a lot of what they're spending their disposable income on is goods, and also durable goods. And so our sales tax revenues have done very well. And so my conversations with Tom Cavett he's told me that, to the extent that this sort of pent up savings sort of sticks around, will sort of buoy our sales tax revenues. But as that sort of starts to drain out of the economy more and more, the pandemic, hopefully wanes a little bit, then you might see more of a normalization of purchases or use of disposable income rather than focusing so much on goods. We might see it shifting a little bit more back towards services. The sort of wild card in here is supply chain issues and inflation. And so, even if people end up buying less goods as they sort of that we drain that disposable income out of the economy, supply chain issues have increased prices, given firms more pricing power. And so, we might still see sales tax revenues being elevated because of that sort of dynamic, where even though we're buying less, the things that we are buying are more expensive. You see that right now with motor vehicle purchase and use. We know that if you look at lots around the state, they're all empty, and so where the market's being constrained by the supply of cars, but the cars that are being sold are not receiving any deals, or the prices are completely elevated. And so our purchase and use tax revenues have sort of stuck close to the very elevated forecast. And I think that dynamic is also possible in the sales and use tax. And so speaking more directly about the needs of the state, I think what Senator Cummings, what you're referring to, is largely demands on general fund programs. That's not to say there aren't demands on education fund programs, but this money, as it's being raised, would really only benefit the education fund. So
unless it gets diverted.
Unless it gets diverted, correct. So,
which has never happened.
Oh, no, never.
But it will be revenue. Graham, Abby, I had someone talk to me, and they talked about services, taxing services to individuals. I use TurboTax, as opposed to some states don't tax services to other business to business services. Can any of you talk to us about that as a differentiation?
Graham, would you like-
I'll let you take that, Abby.
Sure. So I believe it's Iowa that has a commercial enterprise exemption. So any sales for a business use are exempt. And New York also has intra-company, where it's within like a member company exemption. Business to business, as a whole, I would have to go back to my research, but those are the ones that do pop out at me. I think there are some other states that also have commercial use. Let me look at that tax jar map as well.
I remember the last time we took public testimony on this, there is a company in Vermont that does reservations and that service. It's a service. It's software that an individual business uses, as opposed to Expedia that I use. And then we got into and how much customization went on in that software. It sounds like this proposal just says it doesn't matter how much customization, it's all taxable. This is probably as broad as we can go.
Yes, and that was the intention behind it, to try and simplify. It doesn't resolve all issues of complexity, and would still require the department to would definitely need to do rulemaking. There would most likely be some determinations, so litigation at the administrative level.
I think the only thing I'd add on that is my understanding under this bill that, you know, if an individual or a company went to a software developer and asked for a completely customized software solution, that purchase would not necessarily be taxable. If that sort of new software that was designed was being hosted by, say, Amazon Web Services, then only the subscription or the payment to Amazon Web Services would be taxable here. So the delineation here, so like not fully customized software, I think would not be taxable here. I think the Department of Taxes would have to sort of make, you know, rulings on that. You know, what exactly is defined as customizable, but I guess what I'm trying to convey here is for the committee is that, like, you know, specific for a consumer customizable software is not taxable if it's something that's sort of part of a firm's base, you know, software that they sell and it has some customizable portion, then it's more or less the base part of it that would be taxable. But I think that's where my understanding on the bill is, but I'm seeing Abby kind of thinking a little bit more about it.
So if I buy, and that was your chart that you put up, if I buy the service of putting it up on Amazon's website, and then I buy, and then I develop my own web page using another service that gives me the basics, but I can customize the colors, the type, you know, that the service fee to run it for Amazon would be taxable. The base software service would be taxable, but anything that I added on my own wouldn't be? Or would it all be taxable under this proposal?
I don't want to get too far from my skis, but suppose what this kind of sounds like is Squarespace to me. Squarespace like gives you a sort of platform to design your website, and you can customize the fonts and stuff like that. The subscription to Squarespace would be taxable. The hosting fee that you paid to whatever website, call it Amazon or
Right.
that would be
That's enough.
taxable. But if you went ahead, if you took that website that you made and turned it around and sold it to a customer, my understanding is that that's more customizable or a service, and that would not necessarily be taxable.
Yes, Madam Chair, I think I was conflating when you said customization of the software versus the customization of the service being offered, the platform as a service example, where sort of the Amazon Web Services is offering this, you know, customized to what the customer needs, and then they go and use the software online. It's still pre-written computer software, which is canned. It's just the access online that can be a little more adapted to what the customer needs.
Okay. I'm a real estate business. There is a company that will develop a website specifically for your office. And it puts up, you know, it puts up pictures, it puts up your list, you know, it allows you to add your listings and change them, but it does the initial software, the interaction, but it's totally done for your office. And then it's hosted on, I don't know who, Zillow or somebody else. Would that customized piece of software be taxable?
I don't know.
opposed
I don't know
to-
specifically the example, but that kind of sounds like platform to me,
Mm-hmm.
where suppose you're a real estate office and you want to, have customers be able to search the MLS through your website or something like that. You can do customization, for your real estate office, but sort of the base software to do that is purchased from, say, another company. That's what this kind of sounds like. That sort of initial purchase would be what would be taxable. If this company is selling sort of like a base product to many, many different real estate agents, and then
Yeah.
just sort of the final like customization about, pictures and font and stuff like that, and or other things happens on sort of the user end, then the user, the real estate agent, would pay, they pay the company for the use of that sort of base software, and that's what the sales tax would be applied to.
Okay, so I'm a business and I go to another business and I say, I want you to develop a website for me.
Mhm.
And they do that. And yeah, there's links. Now I understand that if I'm a realtor, I pay a monthly, quarterly, I pay a fee to use the MLS. That fee would now become taxable, right?
I don't know whether the MLS is a piece of software. If you
It's
go,
software. It's owned by realtors. Yeah, I think realtor.com now owns it. It's used to be owned by the realtors. But that's a service. It's a platform, I guess, that's up there that I can't access it now because I've retired and my license is expired. But when I was an active realtor, I paid a fee in order to access the MLS. That fee would now be taxable because I'm paying to use that service.
I don't know about that example specifically.
Okay.
But I would say the first example you made where you said, I call a company and I ask them to build me a
Actually,
website.
I think it's Downstreet Video that does. It's Downstreet, yeah.
So-
They do websites and they were in to talk. And they will come in and, use my business, Core Designs. I want somebody to come in and photograph my sweaters, make me a really attractive website that I could then post to Etsy. All right. Now I'm assuming I'm paying Etsy something. That customized website, would I pay a sales tax on that now? Would I pay a sales tax on that? Because that's a business to business. Would I pay a sales tax on that under the proposal? Would that change?
Again, I think I don't know the full specifics, but I think one of two things could happen. So suppose you go to the website design company and you ask them to design a website, and they itemize the portion of the bill, and so they say, here's how much it costs for us to build the website, our services, say, and here's how much it costs to, say, host it. That hosting
I'm going to
portion would
host
be-
it somewhere else. I'm going to put it on eBay stores. Or I'm going to put it on Etsy. All right. So I'm going to purchase the service. It's the actual development of the website, which I used to get in a box, or, I used to buy slides and I posted them. Now I'm going to buy a packaged website, which I could then upload to another server. Now that is my business only. Is that taxable now? And
No.
no,
That's my understanding. No. And I think whether it becomes taxable under this bill would depend upon how customized it is for you. So if they are essentially, again, it's kind of like Squarespace. If they sort of have a base software that they sell to lots of consumers, and the consumer does some customizing on their own, then it's the base part that would be taxable. If you go to them and you say, design me a completely new website,
right,
then that is like, and what they deliver to you is the website. It's completely custom. That sounds to me like customizable software and is not taxable under this. Where the sales tax might be triggered is if the company that's designing the website is using a software to help build the website that they're making for you. And so that's where I think, where you get sort of potential business to business, the website designer uses software to help build your website, even though you've asked for like a very customized software solution. My understanding is that if it's totally customized, then what you would not pay the sales tax.
all right,
On that.
all right. So that is something that individual businesses would be on the hook to determine.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator McDonald. I'm perfectly happy to cede the floor.
The notion that businesses would be on the hook is basically the question we have to decide. And I was trying to think of a couple of the examples that were brought up, like a travel company that purchases services from the cloud, and that allows the travel company to shed employees. They don't have to pick up the telephone and call someone. They don't have to look in a file cabinet and take out a manila folder. They can do a heck of a lot more work and do a lot more travel business by working from the cloud than they used to when they employed people. They can have people work from home that don't have to be in the same office. And if they were to be taxed on their cloud services and they thought that was an imposition and making life miserable, they could go back to hiring more people, getting file cabinets, manila folders, using the telephone, paying telephone tax, sales tax, etc.
You're not gonna do that.
What we have done, what these practices have done in the last couple of decades is to make it more affordable for people to travel and do things, to buy and sell homes with less use of automobiles, all of which accrue to the companies that use these services and accrue to the customers. And we are talking about, should we simply absorb the sales taxes and phone taxes and travel taxes that used to be paid when it was done the old way, in exchange for having a tax on the cloud services, which would be, compared for what folks are getting, a much better deal than they used to get under the old system? Or do we just watch our revenues erode? And I think I'm not a big fan of modernize as an excuse for doing things, but when Graham says, this is a modernizing our tax system to collect a reasonable amount of revenues, given the reduction in cost for all the parties involved, seems like a reasonable move. So, it'll be a new tax on something at the same time that we are watching the taxes we used to get in a variety of ways diminish, while customers and citizens get more for less than what they used to pay for the same things.
Okay, the fly in that ointment is when I hired a photographer who hired a model who took 200 slides of my sweaters. That was a business expense. It was a service, and I didn't pay sales tax on it. So
Well, yep.
now, if I buy the software, I will pay. And I don't, and that was a one-time expense. If I buy the software, it sounds like every time I pay a service charge, I am going to pay a tax.
Yes, but the service charge you pay, you can write off against your earnings,
Yes.
and it's less than you would have paid if you'd have done it the old-fashioned way, with hiring someone to write you something and keeping it work, going back to telephones and manila folders, and having folks in the same office and paying rent instead of having them work at home.
Okay, Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a comment and then a question for Abby. I think my understanding of the way Graham explained it, if you did hire a model and had somebody wear your sweaters and have a photographer take pictures of that person wearing the sweaters, that portion of it still would not be taxable, as long as they broke it out and invoiced you separately for that portion of the service. So you could still do that. It wouldn't be taxable under S53 as proposed. What would be taxable is the software that is used to then create the website that you upload those photos onto. So it's still the same. You wouldn't be taxed for the photography services or the modeling services. You would be taxed for the software package itself.
The software services.
Yeah, so it's pretty much the same, but it does require a business to invoice it separately, so it's not a package deal. If they do it as a package, then it becomes harder to sort of tease out what is taxable and what isn't. So it's a lot of it is about, appropriate invoicing.
Because I was hearing this is if that I hired a photographer to create a website for me, and he came over and he took the pictures, and then he, rather than send me, a box of slides, he sent me a software package that had all the pictures on it.
As long as he bills you separately for the part of his photography services,
Okay.
that portion of it. So if it's, a $1,000 project, just making a round number, and 400 of it is the photography services of him taking the pictures, and 200 is the model, then, you're taxed on the 400 that's attributed to the software package, and not the 600 that's for photography and modeling services. If he bills you as all a package, that this is how much it costs to build a website, then the full 1,000 would be. Am I explaining this correctly, Graham and Abby? Okay. This is what I'm getting from listening to you. So thank you. Your presentation is effective. And Abby, my question to you is, unless I missed it, did we go over the specific language in S53? I was just looking at it. I think it's just 4 or 5 sections. Is that on the docket to look at?
We have not covered that. I'd be happy to show that.
Okay, yeah, let's do that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, that you've broken it out.
My pleasure.
Okay, I will pull up the language. Just a moment.
Can I say this is a strike all?
This is not a strike all.
It isn't? They left our thing in? Okay.
Because it did keep in the feminine hygiene products as passed out of the Senate. Ultimately, that passed in the miscellaneous tax bill.
That's right. We
So
put
that
it
would
on
need to be-
miscellaneous tax.
That would need to be struck from this
Okay.
amendment. And I'll try not to scroll too quickly. I'm going through all of the corporate income tax changes that were proposed.
But we
Sorry.
could use this as a vehicle to make the updates in the language to change it to menstrual products
Oh,
instead of
yes.
feminine hygiene.
That's a
Or
good
we
point.
can just stick that on miscellaneous tax. But this one might have a long road to hoe. So let's see where we go with it.
So the language that hopefully everyone is seeing on your screen right now, the first section amends the sales tax definitions. It adds a new definition. So there would now be 60 definitions within this section. It adds vendor hosted pre-written computer software, which is a term, an identical term is used in Rhode Island, which is also a streamlined state. It's also used in Iowa. It means pre-written computer software that is accessed through the internet or a vendor hosted server or platform. So that gets at your platform as a service, including where the possession of the software is maintained by the vendor or a third party. And that definition applies regardless of the method of delivery or transfer, including whether any downloading occurs, whether the access is permanent or temporary, and whether the charge for the right of access and for the service is on a per use, per user, per license subscription, or some other basis. And this language is taken from both Washington and Massachusetts, and also Rhode Island. They have very similar language, particularly with the method of delivery or transfer, whether the access is permanent or temporary, and then to make it clear, it's irrespective of the type of charge. So that is where you're really getting at this broader scope of the type of software being taxed. The next two sections are both the sales tax section and the use tax section, since they're both in separate sections of statute. You'll see numbers, subdivision 7 is the TPP section. I'm sorry, that's for whoops.
Well,
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't show that, but
9.
that's for advertising. I'm sorry. There is a different TPP section. It says sales tax applies to TPP. Here it's adding a new category. So vendor hosted pre-written computer software and the right to access and use it to perform data processing services is subject to sales tax. And section 11 has identical language, but it's for use tax. Section 12 repeals the exemption that is currently allowing pre-written computer software access remotely to be exempt from sales tax. And then I won't scroll down because I don't want to hurt anybody's eyes. Section 16 makes these 4 sections applicable June 1st, 2022. So it would be for a full fiscal year. Are there any questions, or should I stop sharing my screen?
Committee?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
Abby, this may sound like a silly question, but we just went over all the sort of details and exceptions and this language seems really, does this capture everything that you said in your earlier presentation? It seems really basic.
It does. I was thinking the same thing.
Well, I'm not showing all of the definitions. Sales tax has so many different moving parts. There are different definitions within section 9701. There are also the sales and use tax regulations. It all works together with a lot of moving pieces. So this gets rid of an existing exemption and it applies the tax. And then where all of that complexity comes in is, how do you interpret it? What is the definition broad enough to capture all of that? And in the case of Washington, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, they are taxing a fairly broad scope of different types of software as service.
So this definition of vendor hosted pre-written computer software captures the 3, I'm trying to scroll, the SAS, PAS, and IaaS.
It's very broad.
Yes, it does.
That is the intent. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
But again, it does not, that is the only new definition being created. Other states do not have definitions for those different categories. Even within the industry, there aren't set definitions for that or categories. So this is purposefully broad to be able to capture the different types.
Okay. And would the tax department need to do rules to make it more specific, or is it better to keep it completely broad?
Most likely the department, and you will be hearing from them later, would need to do rulemaking to provide more guidance. There are a few parts of their existing sales and use tax regulations that would need to be amended just because of the not taxing remote access of pre-written computer software. But likely they would have an interest in, providing some parameters and examples. I know a lot of the discussion today and a lot of the discussion around this language usually gets down to examples. So that would be something they would possibly want to include in their regulations. That would be a good question for them.
Okay, thank you.
So Abby, Expedia, booking service, a lot of people use it. I, sign on to Expedia. I book a room. We've already dealt with last year, rooms and meals tax getting, and who does it? Who do I pay a tax for using Expedia, or does the hotel that signs on to Expedia's service pay a tax? Do we both pay a tax?
I'm going to just stop so I can see you. So for the sales tax side, my understanding is you can use Expedia for free online. So there wouldn't be any sales tax for that access as a user. If the hotel, is purchasing their software and then uses it online, currently there wouldn't be, if there's no downloading, there wouldn't be tax. But if they are getting, a software package and they're using it online, then under this proposal, it would be taxed. But then there's the meals and rooms, but that's not addressed in.
Yeah, but they are paying meals and rooms because I'm booking a meal and room. I guess if I book a plane, they're not paying a tax.
I think with the example of Expedia, I only know this because we worked on Expedia and other travel booking sites previously, is that, the customer, obviously, they might have like a service fee that they pay. And we passed that a couple of years ago by making service fees for Expedia part of the meals and rooms tax. So that's where the customer pays. And then my understanding is that the hotel, if they list on Expedia, it's not as if Expedia says, give us a, say, monthly fee. It's they take a share of the booking cost. And so either the hotel pays like a fee on a per booking basis, or they pay, what happens is the customer might pay $120 and Expedia will send the hotel $100.
Right.
And
So
so
who's paying a tax on that $20? Or anybody?
Under the law that we passed a couple of years ago by online travel agents, the Expedia is either expected to remit the sales tax on that portion or send the meals and rooms tax on that portion of the hotel, who will then send it to us.
So they can choose if it's sales or rooms and meals? I thought we just did rooms and meals.
No, so in this case, it's meals and rooms because it's the booking of a
Right.
hotel.
A room or meal. If we pass this, are they also going to pay a sales tax on the service? No.
No.
Yeah, not without software being transferred or access to software.
Okay. Do we know if there's software being transferred?
My guess would be no. This
Okay.
is, it's more of a service that Expedia is providing to consumers, and the hotel essentially lists. So think of it as like, I don't know, like listing a classified ad rather than like a transferring a piece of software that a hotel is using. Suppose Expedia made like a booking platform that a hotel could buy and then embed on their website.
Okay,
Then that would be like a software piece of software. But as Expedia and other travel websites currently operate, it's more just like a listing service rather than a piece of software.
okay. So that software you buy, I think, is what we have or had a local company that they were making and manufacturing. So it wouldn't hit that. It wouldn't hit Airbnb under the same, right? I
No,
booked a room there.
yeah, Airbnb just is a listing. They don't
Yeah,
design like a piece of software that a hotel could use to put on its
All right.
website. So the hotel or whoever the operator is
yeah.
simply listing on Airbnb.
I buy that service from them, or I pay them for that service.
But
I'm paying them to be on their listing. Is that going to be taxable?
no,
No.
that's my understanding is no. So like on Airbnb, say a short-term rental, when something's booked, Airbnb, the operator pays like 2 to 3% to Airbnb. That's essentially just a fee for being able to list on their service. And then the individual who books pays, a 15 to 18% service charge. That is taxable under the meals and rooms tax. It's nothing to do
Right.
with this bill. Yeah.
Okay, but how is that different than my paying a fee? Okay, to TurboTax. I pay a fee to use TurboTax listing of the tax forms, essentially.
Because,
Or,
yeah, it's a great question, because TurboTax, what they're offering online there is like it's a piece of software that like navigates through the tax form that you're
okay,
sort of
okay, so it's
interacting
more
with.
complex. It customizes my taxes. All right. So it's more than just putting a list up there. It's manipulating the numbers.
Yeah, I mean, suppose Airbnb.
It's doing
yeah.
something to the numbers I put in automatically.
Yeah, if like Airbnb and Expedia, for instance, offered a service for a hotel or a short-term rental that you could pay sort of, let's say $100 a month, and you could like make your listing fancy on their, on their website, then that would be sort of, I think, closer to what we're talking about here,
Okay.
rather than just sort of a listing on a generic website. That's not what we're talking about here, because it's not
Okay.
really a piece of software.
It's the manipulation, the software that actually does something. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's it. If we finish walking through the actual legislation or wording, Abby,
Yes.
not much,
That
many
portion's
words.
Not many words, just very complex, and lots of ramifications, but
Yeah.
that part's quite short.
Okay. Committee. Any questions you still would like to get answered? Just think about it. This is our initial run through. Eventually, during the session, if we decide to go forward, we'll take this up, maybe in greater detail, maybe not.
Madam Chair, I have a question.
Yes.
So Abby and Graham, if we go down this road um, it seems to me like we're starting to open the door more towards taxing services,
Yeah.
which several of us probably support. The economy is changing. That's where a lot of sales are happening, through services. What's the next thing to come down the pike that's similar to what we would be taxing here that you could envision?
Graham,
Who's
was
got a
gonna say-
crystal ball?
You tell me, Senator. I guess I would comment on it. I think it's generally a correct statement that this type of product is closer to services than, say, buying something at Home Depot or Walmart. But I think that this is sort of the complexity of a system that's based upon the concept of tangible personal property. Where do you draw the line on tangible personal property? Is software that used to be able to be purchased in a box but is now accessible over the internet, is that can still consider tangible personal property? Is something where you're paying someone to host that software on a server, is that considered tangible personal property? So I would say there's, in terms of the spectrum of TPP, paying a lawyer to defend you in court is much less TPP than this is, because this is sort of more closer to an actual, at one point in time, a tangible, holdable thing. And so I think your comment's generally correct. I don't know what the next direction on this is. And my final comment on this is that Vermont does not generally tax services, but we do tax some things that feel very service-like. So a good example of that is ski rentals and ski boot rentals, right? That's not really it's not really, taxing skis makes sense, but the rental of ski boots and skis is kind of more servicey. And so I where that line is drawn, I think is up to the legislature at the end of the day. I would just, my final comment would be that this is probably closer to TPP than, say, paying your accountant, or paying the commission for your real estate agent, or an automobile repair service, for example.
Okay, Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Graham, have you done any, or you or anyone done any analysis on the sort of types of taxpayers that this would hit or impact positively or negatively? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, not like specifically, modeling about, this taxpayer would pay more, or this taxpayer would pay, well, no one's going to be paying less under this, but I think it really breaks down into two categories. The first is consumers who use these products, right? So individuals who have subscriptions to Microsoft Office, TurboTax, Squarespace, Adobe Photoshop. So just direct consumer purchases from large software, makers, I think is, that's who will pay the sales tax on those purchases. But then the second part is the businesses that use this type of software to, make future software to provide services. So even as something, or not even necessarily people who make service software, it's also, suppose a business has a business subscription to Office 365, they access it remotely. That's something that they would be paying sales tax on, all the way up to, a software developer who uses, I don't know, whatever software they use to design, to code software and to do software engineering, and they would pay sales tax on that purchase. So I think the two buckets would be the final consumers who are paying the sales tax on general consumer purchases, but then also businesses all the way from just a standard old business who pays for a general piece of software like QuickBooks, to software developers who use a lot of this, more I don't know what the word is, more specific types of software to achieve or to build the products that they're making.
But and I'm trying to remember back to our wonderful discussion about corporate income taxes. Their company that's buying some of these aren't if they're now considered taxable, wouldn't they be sort of work product exemptions or something like that? Now, I'm not remembering exactly, but there are some. Abby, do you know what I'm talking about? There are some exemptions for companies when they're buying products and to create other products.
Are you thinking in terms of deductions for cost of goods, like business expenses deductions? Yes,
exactly.
I think that point was made earlier, that would be part of the business's expenses.
Yeah.
Right. So a business who purchases the software would be able to deduct.
Right.
So they're probably already deducting the cost of the software, but now they'd be able to deduct the cost of the sales tax being paid on it. And then I think the only other sort of not wrinkle, but just deeper dive in this is if, let's suppose a manufacturer or a farmer were using a piece of software in the direct use of making sort of agricultural products or a piece of or final product, that would be exempt under the current manufacturing or agricultural exemption.
So maybe you've answered this already, but someone mentioned legal services. So there are a lot of products out there now like LegalZoom, and there's a lot of HR services that sound like they're programs, but they provide support services to back them up. And there's a monthly fee. Is that all dependent upon how the vendor chooses to bundle or separate things out? And in states that have this, have they found any problems where they'll say, okay, the software is 1% of the charge and 99% is the follow-up services, and therefore they avoid the taxation?
That's actually addressed under the current rules for both future upgrades and support services. The current rules for computer software maintenance contracts distinguishes between mandatory and optional, and it does address bundling, but a mandatory computer software maintenance contract is when the customer is obligated to contract to purchase as a condition of getting the software, and that is already subject to tax. When it's an optional maintenance contract, and the customer does not have to buy it. If there are a couple of different caveats here, if it only obligates the vendor to provide updates and upgrades, it will be taxable. If it only obligates the vendor to provide support services, it's characterized as a sale of service and is exempt. But if the optional support services contract is a bundled transaction, then it will be taxable. Because again, it gets back to that. If the vendor decides not to itemize, it's all taxable. If they itemize, then the non-taxable portions remain non-taxable.
This is in Vermont rules right now, you're saying?
Yes. And from what I've seen in other states, they follow. This is pretty typical sales tax policies that are implemented either in statute or regulation.
And I think with respect to your example, Senator Sorokin, it really depends on what the actual consumer is purchasing. So I don't know LegalZoom or other HR platforms, but suppose LegalZoom, all it really was is you paid a fee, and at any point in time you could consult a lawyer. That wouldn't become taxable under this, because I think that's just a service that LegalZoom's providing. Suppose LegalZoom offered something where you could pay a monthly fee, and they would give you software that would help you fill out wills or something like that. Just quick and easy will creating, or offers for real estate. That is more of a piece of software, and that is what we're talking about here. Not necessarily just because you're buying something over the internet, does this trigger taxability under this law? It's more, what exactly is the consumer paying for? Are they paying for a piece of software, or are they paying for sort of more of a like a subscription or a listing or a service service where they can call on, at any point in time.
Isn't
Yeah.
that the challenge? I mean, some consumers might be buying it mostly for the computer software. Others feel comfort that they have a chat function that they can ask questions and it's all part of the package.
So the business in that case, as you mentioned, it can decide whether they want to itemize so for TurboTax, right, you can buy the version of TurboTax that does your taxes and then, offers live support. TurboTax in theory, or Intuit, who owns TurboTax, could itemize, the cost of that subscription and say, here's the portion of that subscription that is the tax portion, and here's the portion that is the live support version. And under this bill, not with the sort of caveats, I don't know exactly how the business model works, but they could itemize it and say, the software portion is taxable under this bill, but the live support is more or less just an accounting service, which was not going to be taxable under this. So, but because TurboTax puts it all in one, then it would all become taxable.
Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, we're getting a long lunch hour today. And we have a much fuller agenda this afternoon. I think we weren't sure how long this discussion would take. So I'm going to give you the long lunch hour, assuming that as you have time to let this all percolate, we may have more questions when we come back. And I think after we hear from some of this afternoon's businesses, we may have more questions. So I think those of us that have meetings through lunch are thankful. And I can go join fiscal for a few minutes. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you back here at 1. Is that correct, Faith?
That's correct.
Okay, we will see
Ending
everyone.